We're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to introduce one of my former colleagues, Melissa Coates-Jones, and she is now a professor in the clinical department at BYU. She did her PhD from the University of Maryland in psychology in October 2006, where she specialized in psychotherapy research. And she has conducted research in the field of psychology for over 15 years and published in peer review journals and has presented at many professional conferences. So I'm going to let her introduce her students and we'll get started. Thank you so much.
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for showing up today. So like Kristen said, I am an assistant professor in the clinical psych program at BYU. Prior to that, I worked for 10 years as an adjunct faculty member in the counseling center at BYU. And when I was doing that, I saw a lot of people who had been victims of sexual assault, both childhood and adult. And a research team that I was working with decided to see what people at BYU's attitudes towards sexual assault were back in 2011, right? Yeah. Yes. And so we did a survey, and then a few years ago, or about a year ago, I was working with these wonderful students and trying to figure out a good project for them to do. And we started talking about some of the changes that have happened culturally in America and at BYU in the last 10 years. And we wanted to see if attitudes towards sexual assault had changed. And so we did a study. They're going to talk about it. I want to introduce my students who I've been working with. They're wonderful students. They're both bound for graduate school, and I can tell will have successful careers. This is Megan Andrus, and she graduated from BYU last year. And this is Albana Riatugi. I'm sorry, I always say her name right. Riadigi. She's graduating this year. She's from Peru and is hoping to go to graduate school next year. We're working on that. We also had a lot of help from Erica Bennett, who is on a study abroad in Washington, D.C. right now, so she couldn't be here, but she helped us a lot. So I'm going to turn the time over to them. We'll have a presentation, and then my hope is we'll have lots of time for questions and discussions at the end.
Oh.
Is it working now? Yeah. Perfect. All right, so first of all, we want to talk about rape culture. So what is rape culture? Rape culture is where sexual violence is considered normal. People aren't taught not to rape, they're taught not to be raped. It includes the idea that men are less able to control themselves, and that a woman is asking for it if she dresses provocatively or has a few drinks. It makes women out to be responsible for being the victim of a serious crime. These ideas promote rape culture, and they are prominent all over the United States, in all sorts of places. Victim blaming, objectifying women, and ignoring the sexual crimes of celebrities and politicians all contribute to rape culture and minimize the suffering of survivors while pushing the idea that for men, sexual dominance is a masculine trait. Fortunately, this has started to change in the last few years. 2017 was the year national news stories involving sexual assault really grabbed everyone's attention. The Me Too movement, given a name by Tamara Burke and made famous by a tweet by Alyssa Milano, showed the nation how common sexual assault really is and created support for survivors. Many people began to speak out against powerful individuals in the entertainment industry, corporate America, professional athletes, universities, and government. During the Senate confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh, Christine Blasey Ford stepped forward and had significant influence on the national conversation around his Supreme Court appointment. Other victims have exposed people like Kevin Spacey, Harvey Weinstein, Matt Lauer, and Bill Cosby. These national discussions led to the 2017 Women's March, where people all over the country protesting the election of Donald Trump due to his misogynistic statements before and during his election. The Time's Up movement brought awareness to the harassment and inequality in the workplace, and Time magazine named the Silence Breakers as Person of the Year. Next, we'll look more at Brigham Young specifically. Most of us here are probably pretty familiar with BYU and its honor code, but let's do a quick review. Every student agrees to not drink alcohol, coffee, or tea, and not to use drugs, and to especially not have sexual contact outside of marriage. The BYU Honor Code also includes strict dress and grooming standards for both men and women. The women's standards focus heavily on modesty standards, such as avoiding tight-fitting clothing or revealing clothing, while men's standards are focused mainly on beards, mustaches, and hairstyles. Traditionally, women have been commonly told that the way they dress influences men around them, and that they should think about how their clothing affects men's thoughts and actions. In 2016, a rape involving a BYU student named Maddie Barney became national news after she revealed that a Provo police officer sent information about her case to BYU. She chose to report the case to the city police rather than to the campus because she was concerned about the Honor Code office becoming involved. The Title IX officer at the time contacted her and said that her case would be turned over to the Honor Code office. Many people at the time also said that Barney had been asking for it because she had been in the man's bedroom and had had a few drinks at the same time of her rape. Despite having already been the victim of a major crime, the Honor Code office launched their own investigation to determine if she would be expelled for her actions, further victimizing her at an already difficult time. Since Maddie's case, BYU has instituted major changes in the organization and enforcement of the Honor Code, including separating the Honor Code and Title IX offices into separate spaces, eliminating any relationship between the two of them, and changing Honor Code policies to allow amnesty for students that have been assaulted, and taking steps to get rid of the tattletale culture of anonymous violation reporting. Within the past 8 years, we hope that these national and local events have made a difference in people's understanding of sexual assault and has led to a less tolerant attitude overall toward the topic of sexual assault. This survey has been used at many different universities and colleges and is, of course, the same survey that we used in 2011. To keep the 2019 survey as close as possible to when it was done in 2011, we used pen and paper surveys again, recruited participants by setting up a booth in the Student Center, and upon completion, they received a $2 bill. It's important to note that this is a cross-sectional design, which means that the participants in 2019 were not the same students that took it in 2011. So let's look at the quantitative findings first. The survey was divided into 4 different sections. This first section asked, would you classify the following as abuse? And had these 14 situations. The items highlighted in blue showed a statistically significant change in responses from 2011 to 2019 when we ran a chi-square analysis. Overall, more people said yes to these questions now versus 2011. Which is a trend we wanted to see. Except for the viewing Playboy magazines and calling a man a player, which had more no responses from both men and women. This section asked, would you classify the following as rape? Again, the blue highlights indicate that these were statistically significant changes from 2011 to 2019, also with a general increase in yes answers. The third section asks, do you believe a woman who is raped is partly to blame if, and then gives different scenarios. As you can see, all of these had statistically significant differences, and we're actually going to break down this section again in just a minute. The last portion asks, would you classify the following as sexual assault? The yes responses from these questions didn't significantly change, but we did see more yes responses from 2011 to now. So let's look at that one section where everything came back statistically significant. So here's the first question. Do you believe a woman who is raped is partly to blame if she is under the influence of alcohol or other drugs? As you can see, there was a significant increase in no answers from both men and women. Legally, this is rape, regardless of circumstances. If a person is unable to consent, then it is rape. The next question, do you believe a woman who is raped is partly to blame if the woman allows the man to spend a lot of money on her and then denies sexual contact? As you can see in 2011, both male and female answers were above 90%. And now they're both at 100%. And this is an awesome thing that we wanted to see. So this next one, consent is a subject I'm very passionate about. And this question says a lot about how people view and understand sexual consent. The question is, do you believe a woman who is raped is partly to blame if she initially says yes to sex, but then changes her mind? I'm glad to see this kind of change in the answers. In 2011, barely half of the male students said no to this question. But that increased significantly in 2019, and with female responses being above 90%. It is significantly better, but there's still room for improvement. Since these surveys were done with pen and paper, some students decided to leave comments in the margins. This question had what I consider to be one of the more concerning notes written next to it. The question being, do you believe a woman who is raped is partly to blame if she initially says yes to sex, but then changes her mind? The note reads, afterwards, yes, she is to blame. During sex, let's think about this, implying that once you've started, you can't change your mind anymore. And then before, no, she isn't to blame. Again, this note is very concerning. This question and its results are interesting because of how specific BYU dress code is, particularly regarding women. There's a very strong modesty culture due to the grooming standards, which could have had an effect on the way participants view this question. The question is, do you believe a woman who is raped is partly to blame if she dresses immodestly? These results show that attitudes have changed significantly in a positive direction in just the past 8 years. What a person wears or is not wearing, it never justifies rape. The results from this question, do you believe a woman who is raped is partly to blame if she agrees to go into a man's bedroom, were only statistically significant for female responses. And you can see that there was a huge jump from 2011 to 2019. Part of BYU's honor code also specifically says that single students cannot enter the bedroom of another person of the opposite sex. Violating this rule can actually risk you being expelled. Similar to the school's dress code and modesty culture, this rule could have had an effect on their answers. It's still distressing to me, though, seeing that nearly 1/3 of male students in 2019 that think that a woman is somehow responsible or at fault for her own rape by going into someone else's bedroom. The next question, do you believe a woman who is raped is partly to blame if she has taken strong painkillers or medication that impairs her judgment? Both male and female responses to this question had more no answers, but again, only the female responses were statistically significant. On this last question, do you believe a woman who is raped is partly to blame if the woman has had sex with a man previously but refuses after an expensive date? The males were the one that showed statistically significant differences. Also, you can see the female no responses in 2011 were already quite high. What all of these results show us is an increase in understanding of sexual assault. Although some areas still have a lot of room for improvement, and there's a lot that we can still do. Next, we're going to move on to the qualitative data with the written responses to the open-ended questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Albana for this one.
Okay. Wait, can you hear me? Okay, so the qualitative findings. There were 2 questions we asked in the survey. First one was, what is the most inappropriate sexual thing that has ever happened to you on a date? And what is the most inappropriate sexual thing that you have ever heard about happening on a date? So we use these open-ended questions to be able to categorize in what we found to be, 11 broad codes. So these are all the broad codes we found. And then after that, we use these categories and divide it into 19 smaller categories to see how similar were the things that were happening, even though they were like different people. So in the female responses, 36% said that they have been, to the first question, what is the worst sexual thing, inappropriate sexual thing that's happened to them on a date? 36 said that they were touched by a partner or a date without consent. 21% said that they were coerced into sexual activity. 20% said they didn't have any experience, and 19% said non-consensual kissing by a partner or a date. I want to focus on 3 specific answers of the woman that I found particularly interesting. First one, it's really small. It says, I've been very lucky, nothing. We found that this was just one of the many women that when they said that they hadn't had no experience with sexual assault, they often said that they felt lucky. Notice how if you haven't had experience with sexual assault, they consider themselves lucky. We live in a time and we are part of a society that now kind of starts to normalizes violence, and it's kind of expected that it's normal for someone of gender of a woman and of this age to experience sexual assault. Second is, I was raped after falling asleep on a date with a man. I woke up to an unwanted penetration through my thin leggings. He said he was asleep. We also found that often men in the dates of women did things and they didn't necessarily knew about it at the time, but then they just portrayed as they didn't know about it. And the last one I found particularly interesting. It says, I really liked the boy. The boy really liked me. He wasn't sure if he wanted to date. One night we were alone after a date. He really wanted to kiss me. I was uncomfortable with that since we were really close friends, and I knew it would put a weird pressure on our relationship. But he kept pressuring me and lightly shaming me. I caved. A month later, our relationship was weird, and I figured out I was being used. Is it my fault that I'm hurting now? Can we notice that even though someone was pressured into sexual assault, it's her that feels guilty and that this is happening to her now, that she feels guilty, that she is hurting. In what kind of society do we live in where the victim is shamed and it's the perpetrator that is being actually questioned? What is the message that we are sending? Next, male responses to the first question. 46% said that nothing inappropriate had happened to them. 19% said it was consensual activity. 17% it was sexual coercion, and 12 said non-consensual touching. In their quotes, the first one I want to talk about is said nothing really. I feel so pressured by society to avoid anything that might be construed as assault, but I guess I missed out on a lot on intimacy. So that last sentence, miss out a lot on intimacy. What does that even mean? Using the meaning given by the Cambridge Dictionary, intimacy is the state of having a close personal or romantic relationship with someone. I'm gonna take the words of Rollos Mays to explain how we have lost our ability to relate to others in a mature, loving way. We are confusing sex with love. Sex is glorified, and those who do not engage in it are seen as unhealthy or missing out on things in life. The next quote, it says, I was touched sexually at a movie without my consent. Despite my refusal, he kept touching me, so I just let it happen. Notice the he. Many of us are way more used to hearing about sexual assault in a heterosexual sense. This is a good reminder that things like sexual abuse have no age, gender, or sexual orientation. The second question, what is the most inappropriate sexual thing that you have ever heard about happening on a date? In the females' responses, 43% said rape, 26% non-consensual touching, 21% sexual coercion, 13% non-consensual kissing, and 12% otherwise unspecified sexual assault. In the males' responses, 57 said rape, 21 sexual coercion, and 12 substance abuse. So, in the case of the significant quotes, if you read over here, females were far more used to saying that they have heard of a friend or it had happened to someone that they were really close to. Like the first one, my roommate once had to run away from her date because he was pressuring her into something and he was getting aggressive. And all of this, kicked her out of the car and told her to walk home if she said no. Or a guy took my friend up to the canyon and he told her he didn't take her home unless she made up with him. Most of the responses were, of course, with people that they've known personally. And in the cases of the male responses, the first one is interesting. One of my friends who goes to a different school says the best way to get in with a girl is to just get her and himself really drunk. And the second one says, in national news, I have heard about rape, abuse, murder, and all the sorts of inappropriate sexual conduct. I have heard stories about people being touched in sensitive areas without their consent, although I'm not sure if I know any of these people specifically. Again, when I focus on this quote, most of the males were most often to say that they have heard of sexual assault in the news and the media, or from a friend of a friend, but they didn't specifically know people who have personally gone through sexual assault. And so the key takeaways to take from this is that females had personal experiences and things happened to them, to people that they specifically know. And the males had less personal experiences. Things they heard about were in the news and not the people they personally knew. So I'm gonna give it back to Megan.
If I can attach this again. All right, so now what? The purpose of the study was to assess the attitudes from 2011 to now, to see if attitudes towards sexual assault have changed. And they have, generally for the better. However, we can do even better. So how can we promote more positive change? Here are some suggestions. better education for students on what abuse is, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual. Believing and supporting survivors and letting them know that it's never their fault. Getting trained and volunteering at places like the Rape Recovery Center and becoming a sexual assault advocate. Providing better access to information and resources for those who need it. Universities, both private and public, should incorporate sexual assault and consent education into their programs. Some schools have already implemented these programs, but they are often afterthoughts, wedged into freshman orientation or part of a non-required elective course. We should be bringing in professionals and offering more information on consent and sex education. And to emphasize, we need more and better consent education overall. Consent applies to even our platonic relationships. Consent is active. Only a yes means yes. Consent is based on equal power. If a person is underage, drunk, asleep, or in a vulnerable state or position, they cannot give consent. Consent is a choice. Consent is never given under pressure. Consent is continuous and requires ongoing communication and trust. A person can change their mind at any time. Also, a wedding ring does not give infinite consent to our spouses. Consent is all about communication.
Thank you. So I just want to say, I forgot to mention at the beginning that I want to give a shout out to my colleagues in the Counseling Center who helped me do this survey back in 2011, Kara Katani and Linny Valentine. And then also this was funded by a great grant from the Women's Research Institute at BYU. So generally, I think the take home is that great things have been happening at BYU as far as attitudes towards sexual assault through some growing pains. One specific thing that comes to mind is, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, one of the deans of our college gave a great devotional about sexual assault, and I think that was a really good sort of turning point for people in our university to think about sexual assault in a different way. But at this point, we want to open it up to you for questions or comments and understand where you guys are coming from. Any questions? Yes, please.
What else is BYU doing to change the culture? That's the part I'm not understanding. Like, why has it changed from 2011 to 2019?
Yeah, so I would say, there's actually people here who could probably answer this better than I, but I would say there's a few things. One is I think it's a cohort effect, so I don't know that it's always just what BYU is doing. I think students entering college now have been exposed to the Me Too movement, they've been exposed to Time's Up, they've watched the Kavanaugh hearings, they've watched Bill Cosby's trials and things like that, and so they're more aware of what sexual assault is. But I also think that BYU has been doing a lot of things. So like that devotional that they gave, there's been a lot of publicity in the national news media about sexual assault. We have a Title IX coordinator that does some work in advocating, reporting it, and understanding what sexual assault is. We have a victims advocate, Lisa, who's here, who is designated by BYU specifically to respond to people who have been victims of sexual assault. So, I mean, like I said, I think it was a tough time period. It was growing pains, and yet BYU, for the most part, has responded in a way that's provided resources for students to understand this better. Yeah, Marlene.
I was hired there in 1993, and I've seen wonderful changes, and I think a lot of it is due to more women faculty who speak up.
Cool. Yeah, more women faculty. That's a great attribution. Sure. Any other questions? Yes.
If you do this again, I would recommend that you consider also how spiritual abuse is connected with sexual misconduct.
Absolutely.
That spiritual abuse, you're worthless now. Now that God doesn't love you anymore.
Right.
You're not a worthy person anymore, so you might as well go ahead and give in.
Yeah, I actually have a colleague, Jenny Bingham, who's doing some great work on both that and the spiritual implications of being a victim of sexual abuse, right? We know that there's physical implications, we know that there's psychological implications, and she's really studying the spiritual implications, that it can really get in the way of someone's spiritual life, their communication with God, their feeling of value. So I think that you're right, that's an important direction to go. Yes?
I just learned that the bishops and bishoprics of the young single adult wards in Provo specifically have been told not to report any confessions to the honor code. And that has been a problem in the past.
Yeah, that's new to me. Yeah, I'd like to know more about that.
Actually, it goes a little bit further than that. The honor code, if the bishop phones and says, thanks for calling, but we're not going to take that.
That's really cool. So they still can not issue an ecclesiastical endorsement, but that's up to the bishop, right? And so, wow, that must be pretty new. I haven't heard
It's
about that.
actually been there for a while,
Wow.
but people think it's,
Oh,
it's been talked about more.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Well, I think like the idea that, and I hope this changes, but part of the grooming for sexual assault victims or survivors is using the honor code as leverage. And so it was a very painful time period when this all made national news in 2016, but I'm so happy. And I think part of it was BYU students live in such a bubble. The phrase is the campus, the world is our campus, but it really is more like the campus is our world. And to acknowledge the fact that it's happening. And I think it was so interesting to see the disparity between men and women about that firsthand account versus just hearing about it in the news somewhere else with some other people. So
Yeah.
I'll be kind of curious to see if that continues to evolve.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I also wonder if students now, I don't think this is working, but I've been told I have to use it. But I also think that students now are coming into BYU. I was started at BYU in 2005. And I think students are coming into BYU with more, because of technology, because of social media, more connections to sort of the world outside of BYU. They keep in touch with their friends at other universities, other colleges. They read their news feed. And so I wonder if, too, they're not, the bubble that we kind of talk about isn't as small as maybe it used to be, that they're more exposed to things outside of BYU that might give them different perspectives on things that they encounter.
Yeah.
Yes?
I'd like clarification about consent and when someone changes their mind
Yeah.
and that engagement. Were you saying that a couple could be engaged in a sexual activity and that post-activity one of those individuals can say that was not consensual without identifying with the partner?
Yeah. Maybe you might want to clarify. I was actually wondering about that slide too. I think consent, the point is that consent is given freely and enthusiastically. And so there the point of that the victim or the person was sort of manipulated, forced, coerced into it. I don't know if that's the quote you're talking about, is the part that we were thinking consent wasn't actively, enthusiastically given. Do you have something to say about that?
I would just say that, like, even if they start engaging in sexual activities and however far into that they are, they can change their mind at any point. They might feel uncomfortable or whatever, and they can change their mind and they can stop it. A lot of times, though, we see things where they don't stop because they've already started. They feel uncomfortable voicing that they want to stop because they feel that they're in a very vulnerable state. So whether or not they voice that they want to stop, the sexual activity, whatever it is, they might not have the voice to, and so afterwards they feel like what just happened to them was rape, even though they weren't able to communicate it out loud in the moment.
So of course we're not saying that consent can be retracted retroactively, right? People make decisions in the moment. But I think that what we want to communicate is that consent is an enthusiastic, so the way I learned it, excuse my language for a minute, but consent is a hell yes and a high five. Right? It's not a, oh, maybe, okay, I don't know. That when we're looking for consent from a sexual partner, it's an enthusiastic response. And if we can train our men and women to understand that definition of consent, I think we can avoid a lot of these really tricky areas. Is that fair to say, Megan? Okay. Megan's the expert on consent.
Thank you guys for talking about this topic. It's so great to be able to have more open conversations and
get rid of some of that stigma and taboo. And positive to see those trends. Obviously, a lot of work to do so. So, many of us, in this field, right, deal with the ramifications of someone who's been a victim of sexual assault or sexual abuse. And even though this information is out there, and they know that it's not their fault, they're not to blame, they still can't always emotionally grasp that. And I wonder if maybe presenting this research to clients, and I don't know the most effective way to do that, but to help them see these statistics and help them learn about these studies, and maybe if they realize that they were truly victims, and that can take away some of that self-blame. So I guess I'm kind of putting that out there to see if there's any effective strategies to help clients that we're dealing with in counseling that still feel that blame and that fault, even though it's clear that they are not at fault.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tricky thing. That's what we as therapists who work with people who've been sexually assaulted work with all the time, right? Advocating for them, but also validating their experiences, helping them understand that, and helping them understand the decisions they made and where they might not have had decisions. Marlene, you wanted to say something?
Oh, yes, I have to put in a plug for a really good book.
Okay.
It's called A Better Way to Teach Kids About Sex, and it came from the MFT department professors, published by Deseret Book.
Cool.
And it makes an argument for no more standard night talks about chewed gum, damaged wedding cakes, torn up wedding dresses, women being responsible. That modesty is just about, don't give any men bad thoughts.
Yeah.
I mean, they can get them on their own, but women aren't responsible for bad thoughts. It's an excellent book. And I think starting clear back in the way we teach our children and our youth about what sexuality is about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have 4 young sons, and we talk, and I'm kind of corny, I get it, I'm a therapist, but we talk about bodily autonomy, right? They get to decide if they want to be hugged or not, and that can kind of be foreign to like the grandma or the great aunt that comes and just smothers them, but they just say bodily autonomy, and then they get to choose if they want to be hugged or kissed or not. And it's, if they're little, I don't think it's going to have a huge consequence, but what I want them to learn is they get to choose what they do with their bodies, and that other people can't force their physical bodies upon them. And so that means sometimes I don't get hugs when I want them, but that's a consequence of teaching of this.
Yeah. Can I also just add a personal?
Please.
So I also have 2 children of my own, and my 8-year-old son doesn't like hugs or being touched. And so I ask him all the time, because I'm a mom, I love to hug him. But again, we try to teach sex positivity, consent, and everything like that. And so, I ask, do you want a hug? And he says no, but a high five is good. So I'll give him a high five. And then also with my daughter, who is 6, I find her in the morning standing in front of the mirror in her bathroom going, I'm in charge of my body. And like practicing that over and over again, because we, again, teach consent and that she's in charge of herself and she can control what happens to her in her body.
I also love the way we're changing how we talk about modesty within the church, that it's not about controlling men's thoughts. It's about dressing in a way that I talk about it in terms of dressing in a way that makes us feel comfortable and makes us be able to engage with the world in a way that we want to, right? And we get to choose that. Did you have that?
This is a thought that I've had listening else, because I think all of these changes and attitudes are fantastic, and I love all of it. But one thing that's just kind of in my head that is conflicting is there a way to teach, like you were suggesting, like a freshman orientation thing. I'll say, is there a way to teach about consent and at the same time teach how to protect yourself from sexual assault without undermining the other?
I think that's a really tricky thing. You guys might have better ideas about that, but like there's a really tricky sort of dialectic between teaching self-defense and teaching consent and things like that. Do you have any ideas about that? Or does anyone else have any ideas about that?
I'm still learning myself and trying to think of ideas of what's the best way to
help people in that situation so that they learn about consent for themselves, but also can defend themselves in case of that scenario. And I don't know, like, what is the best solution yet, but I'm still learning, so.
Yeah, actually, now that I think about it, I think some of the good solutions are to teach people what rape myths are, right? Sometimes we think that people who are raped are the ones walking in dark alleys at night, or are ones who are dressed immodestly, or just drinking or getting drunk. And what we know about rape is that it's most commonly partner rape, someone they're dating. And so I wonder if teaching more about having good boundaries and verbalizing to your date what's acceptable and what's not, that I think could go a long way towards teaching how to protect yourself. Because we're not talking about teaching you to protect yourself from a stranger in a dark alley necessarily, but how to protect yourself from a date who maybe has different intentions than you're anticipating, and how to negotiate that with them.
Yes.
I was just going to say, I've seen that the whole, what grandma, mother, and aunt has not warned her daughter of all these things without communicating that it's not her fault.
Right.
So it's a tough communication. I think if you come to present, you need to become an expert on that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Yes.
Just on the sexual assault front and self-defense, I mean, BYU does offer courses on self-defense. My daughter took them.
Yeah.
Then she went on a group date where she was with a particular guy, but he wasn't the guy who ended up driving her home. He got dropped off early, so she was alone with the guy who happened to be driving the car. And he locked the doors when he dropped her off, and he tried to kiss her. And she put his hand in a hole that caused him so much pain that he quickly unlocked the doors and let her out.
Wow.
But I think it gets to the point where you can prepare and plan and be as knowledgeable as you could be about rape myth, but sometimes you get trapped in a situation, and frankly, that physical defense class really helped her out.
That's great. Yeah.
I like to use the metaphor of the elite athlete who eats a great diet, runs all the time, is healthy, does all the right things, and then dies of a heart attack suddenly, or gets cancer and dies.
Yeah.
You can do everything right that's wise,
Yeah.
and bad outcomes still occur,
Yeah.
and it's not the fault of the person who had bad outcomes.
Thank you. And I think that in answer to your question, sir, that's something we can communicate to our children, not just our daughters, right? Men are victims of sexual assault as well, and we can communicate to them. These are some wise things to do in life it's sort of like the gospel, right? These are some wise choices you can make in life to avoid consequences that might be damaging. And sometimes bad things happen to good people, right? Sometimes even if you're making all the right choices, there's something that happens that you didn't have control of. And I actually think that's a pretty significant life lesson for everyone, right? Not just for young women. Did you have something to say? Yeah, please, Albana.
Okay. Just so I can jump in with this. I think one of the important things is just communication, but a reminder that even if you teach your children that these things are going to happen, like we mentioned, bad things can happen. When I was 14-year-old, a man touched me inappropriately in a car. I was wearing my school uniform. Nothing out of the ordinary, was bust and jeans. And I went to my dad and I told him, and the first thing he said, it wasn't my fault. And I think it's the way that you talk to them. I grew up from an experience, and I don't feel that it was my fault at all. And again, it's a good reminder that you have to teach these things, that these things happen no matter how good or bad you can be, no matter how, if the sun is out, if it's night, they can happen anywhere. But if you communicate to them that the importance of knowing these things, and even in that moment, you want to tell yourself that you can react, right? Like, I think it's great that your daughter defended herself. I froze, and that's also okay. Like, it just a reminder that these things happen, and we just need to talk more about it, understand more of the subject.
Albana, thank you so much. I'm so glad your dad responded that way. And that's the other thing I want to say is that with someone who's in a situation like that, we can all say, oh, they should have fought, they should have done this, but their only goal there is to survive, right? To get out. And our bodies do that in lots of different ways. We fight, we might flee, but we also sometimes freeze. And whatever we need to do to survive that, I think, is something that we cannot judge from the outside. Lisa.
I just wanted to go back to Michael's comment. I think it is perfectly appropriate in dealing with someone who's been sexually assaulted to talk about what you know about research. Yeah. So if you, for example, if you're sharing Rebecca Campbell's work on just what you're talking about, tonic immobility or rape paralysis, if a client says, I'm frozen, I don't know why, you say, well, let me tell you, there's this thing out there and it's real and it's called this. So I think the more we know, and she's using our professional judgment as to when to share what, but I think it can be really, really valuable to share what we know out there about sexual assault, about the way women respond, about why this happened or what happened.
Absolutely.
So I think it's not necessarily having, a book that here's all the statistics, but if we have a really good basic knowledge of that, we can then use our judgment to decide, well, this might be helpful right now.
Thank you. So yeah, that's a great plug for Rebecca Campbell's work. I don't know if she has a book, but there's a number of articles, and then if you're not the reading type, there's a really good YouTube video too about her work, about sort of explaining how sexual assault, the impact of sexual assault and how people react in those situations. Was there another comment? Yes.
Excuse me. Does this research correlate with other research from whether it's institutions like universities or any other body? In other words, how similar or different are the results? And then the second question, different one really, is does this lead to any specific recommendations on how to treat therapeutically individuals who find themselves in this kind of a situation?
Sure. In a situation where they've been assaulted? Yes. Yeah, so in answer to your first question, when we did the original survey in 2011, we compared it to data from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. And what we found is that BYU students, and of course it's a different population, BYU students were much more likely to attribute blame to the woman for sexual assault. And the most significant one by far was for modesty, right? That was the one that really disturbed me the most in 2011, how almost half of men believed that women were partly to blame for being raped if a woman was dressed immodestly. And in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that wasn't something people generally believed. So we have some limited data on that. We don't have data comparing now to, I don't know of any other universities who've done those surveys in the last year or two. So it's been 2011 since we've had data to compare it to. We're certainly looking at that. In answer to your second question, I think there's a whole literature out there about how to do effective therapy with people who've been sexually assaulted, right? My sort of go-to is always validate, and I think one way as therapists that we can validate their experience, where we can empathize with their experience, is like Lisa said, knowing the research, knowing the data, knowing what happens, knowing people's experiences. So knowing that even though a lot of people think that dressing immodestly is a precursor to rape, it's not, right? That's a cultural thing here that sometimes we think of, but in fact, people are more likely, this is a fact I always throw out, people are much more likely worldwide to be raped in burqas than they are in bikinis, right? What we wear has nothing to do with when we're raped, right? And so I think just throwing out things like that, helping the patient understand and empathize with what they're going through, but knowing how to place it contextually in the world and in the culture. Does that make sense? I think do we have time for one more? Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
So I had an experience this year. My practice is in Salt Lake, so you wouldn't think I would. I have children at BYU, but I had a young girl from BYU come to Salt Lake to be my client earlier, well, maybe last spring. And she is, just a darling, BYU co-ed, and she had been raped down at BYU and had gone into she's on a date, went into his apartment after her date and had a migraine, fell asleep on their couch and his roommates weren't home, woke up and he was raping her. She reported it to her parents. They called me, she came in, clearly, so traumatizing for her. She actually ended up dropping out of school. Encouraged her to report, she did. And they called him in and he said, absolutely not, that did not happen. And so they reprimanded her for being in his room and for falling asleep. And like I said, she left the university. But I just wonder in those situations, I understand having to protect male students too from misinformation, but I was surprised the university didn't reach out, talk to me as her therapist, talk to just due diligence. They talked to her and just said, okay, these are the facts. She told them, They basically said, we talked to him, he said it didn't happen, it's closed. It was kind of disturbing to me that that was it. She's still, getting trauma treatment, and it's totally changed the course of her life. He's still a student there, he's still dating, he's still doing all these other things. Anyway, not that we need to solve that here, but I don't know what steps need to happen to make that not.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know either, and I'm certainly not a spokesperson for BYU in this setting. But I will say it's complicated, right? Like he said, she said, there's Title IX offices, there's police reports, there's honor code reports, and I think what I do know is that within the last 8 years, there's definitely been a direction more towards believing victims, not punishing them for honor code violations, like being in the person's apartment that maybe were sort of inconsequential to the rape. So I don't know. I mean, it's very unfortunate, and I do think positive changes are being made, and stories like that just break my heart. I guess that's the only way I feel like I can respond. Yeah, I'm sorry that happened.
Yes.
So just going back, sorry, the other woman's comment just about, we've been talking about enthusiastic consent, but we're talking about this story of she consented and then halfway through this sexual act, she's deciding she doesn't want to do this anymore. So what is the advice then? Because the story I heard was, so she felt uncomfortable and at the end she felt raped, but I'm thinking, but what did she say and how did she communicate that? So is it the same enthusiastic no as in an enthusiastic yes, like hell no kind of a thing? Is that kind of where we're...
Yeah, I mean, I am not I don't know, right? Consent is one of those sort of, it's on a continuum, it's complicated. I think best practice is consent should be, I'm excited about this, and once I'm not, I am not anymore, and we stop. I think it's certainly possible to stop mid-sexual activity if the person is uncomfortable with it. I think that should be a best practice. But I do think there are some people that, interact sexually with another person and then later regret it, right? And that's a sort of just a normal consequence of having interactions with other human beings. And we certainly don't call that rape, right? We call it an unfortunate encounter or regret or a bad date or something like that. But I think if we can think more in terms of consent as being ongoing, enthusiastic, clear, then it can help with some of these situations be made clear. Does that help at all? Tell me how I can help more, because I might just not have the answer.
No, I think you're saying that. I think it's the communication either way, like the ongoing concept that if at some point in time this is making you feel uncomfortable and you don't want to do it
please,
anymore,
let's talk about it.
you need to say that to the partner that you're having sex with, and have that communication with them so that they are aware.
Right. And we need to teach women to be in touch enough with their bodies that they know when they want to stop, and to not sort of feel like they owe an obligation to someone of sexual activity once they've started. Did you want to, this gentleman in the back, you've had your hand up.
Having been an expert witness in court, how does the plaintiff attorney and the defensive attorney define for the jury an enthusiastic yes?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think what we're talking about here is certainly not a legal definition, but what I'm hoping is that in relationships with people that we can, for ourselves, and we can teach our clients and our children how to enthusiastically communicate yes, or how to withhold consent, right?
Part of the problem is that intimacy is developed by and large by nonverbal cues as opposed to verbal cues.
Written is nonverbal.
That's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Written contract is nonverbal.
Right, and I don't, and I think that maybe we can start to change some of that narrative sexually, right? That a sexual interaction, we can have more verbal communication about it. That's what I want to teach my children, is that when you're, hopefully not for a long, long time until they're married, but when you're having a sexual encounter with someone, it is your job to determine if they are interested in that and if they're reciprocating your interest, and it's your job to determine that over and over and over again. Did you have a comment?
That was essentially my comment, what you just said. I think it's so interesting. There's a big part of rape culture that we talk about a lot, which is victim blaming. And there's been such huge progression in that. It's so beautiful to see. There's another part to rape culture as well, which is unfolding right in this room, which is how do we protect potential victim, what do we need to teach them to protect themselves? And I think there's something faulty there.
Yeah.
Whereas we're probably going to be much more effective, and actually came up in one of the quotes from your study, by teaching potential perpetrators to not rape people. And that's where people struggle with the gray area. It's not a legal gray area. It's for people to say, I'm not going to move forward unless I get the high five.
Yeah, yeah.
If I don't keep getting the high five, I'm going to stop and wait for a high five.
Yeah.
And putting that responsibility and teaching that responsibility, it came up in the study when somebody said, nothing's come up because I feel so much pressure from society to not rape people.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's so well said. Thank you so much. Jeff, we have time for one more comment.
Consent with this is different than like consent to go to a movie. You can talk your partner into going to go to a movie, and we hear all these cute stories of grandmas and grandpas. I had to ask her 47 times before she went out with me, right? And oh, what a cherished memory. Well, that's okay, I think, when you're asking someone to go to a movie, but when you're talking about sexual intimacy and connectedness, the bar has to be much, much higher.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of changing that narrative, right? Of men being the or the aggressors and women having to defend their sexuality, and changing it to both of them coming together to agree upon an activity that they both will hopefully enjoy. Yeah. Okay. I think we're done. Thank you so much for your comments and for your really active participation. I appreciate it.